Alright guys, Unit 2, Part 7, notes quickly. This should be pretty brief and everything's right there for you. To measure voter turnout, there's two ways to do it and you can read them there. Although the first method looks better, the second method is going to be the one that's actually used most times to point out the low voter turnout in the United States. We typically look at the percentage of the eligible voters that show up to vote. And this is what we compare to other countries as well. Although, like I said, method number one may look better. Method two is the one that we actually end up using. What do I mean that it looks better? If you take a look at just a proportion of registered voters that vote, it shows that we have great voter turnout. But in reality, if you use the second method, your percentage of voters that are eligible to vote that actually show up on the average, we got a little less than 50%. So you're in the 40% range. There are some anomalies. The highest voter turnout that we've ever had in U.S. history was for the 1896 election. And you had some really great voter turnout in the early 1800s for the 1800 election, 1812 election. We've got great voter turnout then, but since then, our voter turnout has been very, very low. More recent anomalies would be the 2004 election. 2004 election had a little over 50% of the voter turnout, but this is still incredibly low when you compare us to other democracies, and you can see some nice statistics down below, especially Italy and Australia, which boast about a 90% voter turnout rate, and they're talking about percentage of eligible voters. The big deal here, the reason that these things are actually looked at, is because of the great disparity between the two methods. When you look at the two methods and you see that if you count voter turnout as a proportion coming in at 75 to 80%, and then you actually look at the percentage of eligible voters coming in at 50% or less, it points to there has to be an issue, and a significant issue, and most people believe that the issue can be solved, and the issue that they point to typically is voter registration. Why is this such a big deal? Mostly because of stuff that was covered in Unit 1 and mentioned in class. Voter registration is supposed to be a state right, but it's turned into a national debate, and the federal government has stepped in. All states, with the exception of the freak state of North Dakota, are going to require voter registration prior to an election. And as much as 30 days prior to. North Dakota, you can actually walk in the day of, register, and then vote, which is kind of nice. Federal law has had to step in with voter registration over the years, and no state can require you to register more than 30 days prior to an election. There were times when states were requiring people to register 6 months in advance, and it just caused all types of problems. And we saw that in history plenty of times with ideas like vote early and vote often. So there's some examples down at the bottom of the page for you. So we go back in time to 1993, and you've got the Voter Registration Act, also called the Motor Voter Bill or Motor Voter Law. And there's three big parts that you can see here. The big one, why it was called Motor Voter, was because if you renewed your driver's license, you were allowed to register at the same time there. The kicker that a lot of people seem to forget is the third little bullet here, that it made it illegal to remove people from voting rolls for inactivity. This was very common. You found, especially in southern states, they would say, "Hey, look, we've got blacks on the voter rolls. See, we're not discriminating." And it was their way around the Jim Crow laws and grandfather clauses. They would start removing people because they didn't show up to vote, and it would just simply be one election. And this happened at the local level a lot of times, caused all types of problems, and really caused mass discrimination. It was a way, it was a loophole, it was a way around the laws. Motor voter bill, motor voter law actually takes care of that. And this law actually has supporters. People say, hey, great, these are all great things, and the three major pieces are listed above. Believe it or not, there were critics to the bill. Why would you not support this kind of bill? Because you thought, one, it could be costly. Number two, you thought that there were inherent issues with it, like, oh, maybe what if somebody lies when they go to get their driver's license? Um, a lot of people thought that this would also uh, inundate the system with too many people at one time, and then people would get lost in the shuffle, and you couldn't check to actually make sure they could be eligible to vote. And ultimately, the bill passes, no problem, in 1993. So the first election it gets to be used on is 1996, and people thought, "Wow, you know, this is a great opportunity. More people will vote." Uh, Supporters of the bill pointed to the fact that there could be as many as 49 million people will now be registered. It made absolutely no difference in voter turnout in '96. None. So there's no clear data that shows that the motor voter law has had an effect on voter turnout because statistical data has looked the same since the first eligible presidential campaign and election in '96 after the passing of the bill. In 2002, the Help America Vote Act uh, came out, and the purpose was to improve the system overall of allowing people to vote and registering people to vote. It created a registration database, and it had massive problems across the United States. And you can see there the issues. Election day, not just elections in 2002, which are your interim elections, but it also left issues with election day in 2004, which was a presidential campaign. People are actually turned away at the polls because of the issues, and they couldn't be solved in time before the polls closed. So, other reasons people don't show up, some common reasons, of course, there's always the weather one. It's more common than you would think. It's actually one of the most common ones. Um, Another one of the most common ones you'll see at number three, the fact that when we hold elections, a lot of Western European democracies hold their elections either on a Saturday or they actually have a national holiday for it. The Constitution of the United States and U.S. law state that all elections are to take place on the first Monday following the first Tuesday in the month of November in even numbered years. And that means it's going to be a weekday. It's a Tuesday. We don't declare a national holiday. People can't get off of work. People always say ridiculous things. What do you mean you can't get off of work by 7 o'clock at night? Well, they're working real jobs. Not everybody has flexibility. Not everybody's a school teacher, for crying out loud. Other reasons people don't show up to vote, they say there's difficulty with an absentee system. There are people that uh, aren't home on election day, or they're nowhere close to home. They travel. If this is the case, then you may request an absentee ballot. But some states have a requirement. If you want an absentee ballot, you have to ask for it in person. Well, that doesn't work if you're working overseas, if you're in the military, all those happy things. There's a lot of reasons that it can't work. Number two here, the number of offices to elect is huge. It, a lot of people will cite this as the reason that they don't vote. There's just too many elections, too many offices, and because they don't know any of them, they just don't show up. So don't underestimate that one there. One last reason people claim that they don't show up is because the political parties just they don't do what they once did. The reason we had higher voter turnout in the early 1800s, even at the tail end of the 1800s, is because political parties used to actually show up at your door and drive you to polling places if you needed a ride. Um, Nowadays, our political parties stage what is known as get out the vote campaigns, and that's just you get out there, talk to people and say, hey, you should vote for this guy, and this is why, and you get people riled up before an election, but they never show up. Nowhere close to the same thing as what political parties used to do. However, recent elections, 2004, 2008, even 2012, you have this introduction of what are known as 527s. They're called 527s because that's the tax code that applies to them. They've actually started to go back to those 1800s methods. They call people up and remind them to vote. They show up and transport people to polling places, so forth and so on, which has increased the percentage of people slightly. In 2004, we had over 50% of people showing up to vote. 2008, we were a little less than 2004, but still about 50%, slightly over 50%, whereas we were below 50% for quite some time. When you compare the US democratic system and voter turnout versus other democracies, you find that in other democracies throughout the world, the people show up and vote. We tend to engage in what's known as non-electoral political participation. We'll campaign, we'll give money, we'll talk, but we don't actually vote. The real question here is, does it make a difference? And two sides of it. One, those who would say no, it doesn't make a difference if people don't show up because it's their way of saying we're happy, we like the way it is. And if people don't show up and vote, people say it's okay because the representative system that we have is virtual representation. Nobody's going to make a decision to hurt you when you and they are so closely aligned that a poor choice for you will mean a poor choice for them. Other people say, yeah, it's a big deal that there is low voter turnout because it shows that we're apathetic, that we don't really care. And that's going to lead to takeover and manipulation, that it will undermine the entire democratic system. So there's evidence to both sides. It's how you want to take it. In the end, the big thing here is, can you answer these questions? And I got a nice little series of questions here for you. These are the things you need to think about when you think about voter turnout. Is registration a difficult thing? Do we need to move elections to weekends? Should we make it a holiday? Well, these things increase our voter participation. And does increased voter participation really mean a darn thing? If you get everybody showing up to vote, but they don't know who to vote for, or they don't know what they're voting on, is that actually helping the system? These questions are things that you really need to think about, because if you let all the eligible people vote, if you force all the eligible people that can vote to vote, there's a lot of stupid people out there. What if they show up to vote and they vote in masses and they elect a poor choice, a poor candidate? What does that do for the entire system? So just some questions to think about, and things that we'll discuss in class over the coming days. But that's pretty much it for the Part 7 notes. Be on the lookout for Part 8.